Hi, welcome to the second lecture in my series on Søren Kierkegaard. Today I'm going to be discussing the genius of Søren Kierkegaard. And in the course of discussing Kierkegaard's genius in a very basic introductory way, I hope to introduce more of his significance in his historical context. So this will be a sort of development of many of the themes I introduced in the first lecture, and it'll be a pursuit of some of the new themes that I want to introduce throughout this course. So let me start with the idea of genius. Genius is a historical idea. The word genius, genius, for example, we have the phrase from Latin, genius loci, or the genius of a place, has a reference to a certain spirit or spiritual dimension that was part of ancient cultures. So, for example, that phrase, the genius of a place, referred to the idea that there was a spirit that was part of every place. And so therefore pleasing or displeasing that spirit could affect your relationship to that place. So this is just part of an older idea of genius, and I'm not going to give a history of that idea here, but I want to point out the word and the concept in one sense are quite old. They go back to antiquity. However, the modern idea of genius, which is what we're talking about really, goes back to the very period of Kierkegaard, and particularly of the Romantics, the early German Romantics, or the Frühromantik, in particular. It was the Romantic movement that ended up codifying a certain idea of genius, which has in many ways influenced all of us today. Now, I want to start with a few basic ideas about genius, none of which I'm claiming in any way are original. In fact, what I'm about to say, I'm pretty sure is drawn from a famous quote, but I'm forgetting the author. But the idea is that a genius accomplishes something easily that no one has even thought of doing. And this is an idea of genius that I think is quite useful. So I want to use it to now develop the idea that what is difficult for a genius is impossible to have even thought of for a non-genius. Now, we don't necessarily like the idea of genius today because we have concerns about genius being inegalitarian. However, our concerns about egalitarian are deeply hypocritical because we all like extreme excellence. We all like to see our favorite athletes, our favorite actors, our favorite celebrities, our favorite chefs. We want to enjoy what they do, and the reason we enjoy it is because they're very good at it. So first of all, I don't think any of us have a problem with people being very good at things. We would all enjoy a world in which everyone was very good at everything that they did. That would be a nice world. So I think that's helpful to recognize is we're not really concerned about the idea that some people are really good about things. Everyone likes that idea. Sometimes it makes us upset if we're not good at them, and we can be jealous. But that's not the real egalitarian concern with genius. The more substantive concern with genius that maybe could get in the way of us appreciating this lecture in Kierkegaard is the idea that some people are just, in some sense, better than other people. In other words, the idea here is just unfairness taken to an extreme. But this is actually also isn't a critique of genius. This is just a critique of existence. And we'll see someone like Kierkegaard could be really useful in that pursuit of a critique of genius as part of just a critique of the way the world happens to be. Kierkegaard's own relationship to genius was ambivalent, but he had no question that he was a genius. Kierkegaard knew he was a complete, absolute example of the category of genius. But the egalitarian part that matters to us, so it can't be the excellence. We like people who are good at things. We all do. Whether we're comfortable with it in our personal life is a different question. And we also don't really worry about genius when we're talking about the fact that some people are just better than other things than other people. That's not so much about genius, that's just reality. Genius would just be an extreme form of that general phenomenon. And if we have a problem with that, we have to kind of take it up with the cosmos, because it's not certainly a critique of the individuals who happen to be apparently very good at things or born with things. So is there any egalitarian critique of genius left that can have some validity? I think so. There's a valid egalitarian critique that a focus on genius, given the fact that genius is connected to the intrinsic inequality of reality, the apparently intrinsic inequality of the distribution of gifts, something, for example, that many political theories do not know what to do with. I would suggest in passing, neither liberalism nor communism or socialism have any good way of reckoning with the kind of extreme distribution of talent, apparently, in the world. So, but the real problem then that you could say an egalitarian might have, and in this sense, I think we could all identify with this egalitarian concern with genius, is this. Focusing on genius focuses our attention on something that apparently has no value to us because we can't imitate it to attain it. And it'll lead us to neglect everyone else who isn't at this level. Now, that's, I think, a pretty fair idea if someone's concerned, well, Sam, I don't want to just think about, geniuses because then we're going to leave a lot of people out. That's a reasonable concern. However, the question is, why are we interested in people like Søren Kierkegaard? And the reason is because they did something very exceptional. They had an enormous influence on individual people, on space and time, and over significant periods of time, which has continued to sort of prove their relevance. So in this sense, I think, having acknowledged 3 different levels of concerns we might have about thinking about genius from an egalitarian perspective, I want to suggest that actually an egalitarian in the best sense, which is simply someone concerned for the just distribution of things in society and the world, an egalitarian wants to pay a special attention to genius. So in point of fact, here's why we need to pay attention to genius in general. First of all, if people are extraordinarily, uncommonly, inexplicably good at things, those people will give us a unique degree of insight into human nature, for good or ill. They might be very bad. For example, Hitler's obviously a very bad human being. And there's an extraordinary anecdote about him by Orson Welles, who met Hitler. And when Orson Welles met Hitler, when the Nazi Party was very new and sort of just this crazy party that no one thought would have any serious political influence, Orson Welles tells the story of having met, a couple of other people who became very famous Nazis, very famous members of the Nazi Party. And he said, sitting next to me in this beer hall in Austria was Hitler. And Orson Welles said he was a complete nothing. He had no memory of him. That's how insignificant Hitler was in his mind. You could say, Sam, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Well, here's the thing. He said, the point of this story, I think this was on the Dick Cavett show, is Orson Welles says, no, that's the point of the story. He wasn't anything until there were 5,000 people shouting Sieg Heil or Heil Hitler. Now, eventually when there's 5 million people shouting that, say, or 1 million people, or a whole country of people, you're going to have a very different effect. So the kind of genius that Hitler was, and Hitler was a type of, you could say, political genius, is someone who is completely created. You could say it's a horrific genius of the masses. So there is a type of person whose genius is, you could say, extrinsic to their personality, because in a sense, they have no personality. And because they have no personality, they become extremely capable under certain conditions of channeling the energy of other people. So I want to mark this out because I'm going to suggest to you that this is, of course, the opposite of what we're going to think of as genius typically, which is individual genius. But of course, individuals have this ability. Very great politicians of any kind or party essentially have the capacity to receptively channel the energy of their political communities. I think Barack Obama, for example, is one of our best politicians by this measure. And in terms of charisma, you would probably look at Obama, Clinton, Reagan, if you're just thinking about a type of charisma in office. And that charisma partly has to do with the fact that they are able to receive the impressions of the people who they need their support of, and they're able to channel their energy in a way that people feel identified with them. Now, this is interestingly getting us close to an idea of genius that's connected to Kierkegaard and the Romantic movement, which is genius has some association with the idea of being profoundly receptive. And in this sense, in the problematic patriarchal gender coding of attributes of reason and emotion throughout Western history, genius has, from that perspective, a strongly feminine or receptive dimension. I'm just referencing this historically, and this is an important thing, though, that actually the Romantic idea of genius is an idea of genius that slants away from traditional masculine qualities towards traditional feminine qualities. And this is part of why the artist, for example, has emerged in the modern world as the quintessentially androgyne figure, because the artist in many ways blends what we would think of as gender categories. And if you look at the 60s or the 70s or figures like, Bowie, for example, Bowie has this incredible capacity to channel something that is incredibly erotic and sexy, I think, no matter who you are or how you self-identify. And it doesn't fit any category. There's something maximally, I would suggest, human about this sort of pansexual appeal. And it's connected, I believe, to a type of receptivity to things in which, for example, most of us are screening out many aspects of our desires or our personalities or of our environments for good reasons, perhaps, maybe to protect ourselves. But somehow we wouldn't be able to assimilate those things, and we don't want to deal with them. Now we're coming much closer to the idea of genius that I think is relevant for Kierkegaard, which is, I'm going to suggest to you the Kierkegaard nature that we're trying to understand under the category of genius is the idea of someone who is very gifted at suffering. So the genius of Kierkegaard has to do with the genius of suffering. And I now want to explain that in a way that I hope will appeal to those of you who are like, where's this really going? How's it connecting with the other themes about German idealism? And I want to now discuss one of the fundamental themes of German idealism that I introduced in the course of my lecture in the first part, but I've also introduced in other lectures I've done publicly, which is there is a fundamental tension in Western philosophy between activity and receptivity, particularly as it concerns the intellect. Is the intellect fundamentally active, which in one sense it must be if you understand it in the ancient Greek tradition, or is the intellect fundamentally passive, which in another sense it somehow must be if you understand it in the Greek tradition? And this goes back to a very significant metaphysical debate. Some of you may be familiar with the debate over the so-called passive intellect in Aristotle, which becomes in a way one of the most important metaphysical debates of the Islamic philosophical renaissance that then is influencing the medieval Christian philosophical renaissance. So all these thinkers from Avicenna to Aquinas, for example, are very concerned with this issue of the passivity or the receptive intellect versus the active intellect. Now, you don't need to know any of that to appreciate Kierkegaard, or I hope the rest of what I'm going to say, but I'm flagging already that just by touching on what seems like an unrelated issue, which is just genius itself, what it is, whether we're comfortable with it, we've actually already introduced some of the fundamental themes, not just of the philosophical tradition Kierkegaard is part of, but notice we also introduced the theological themes that are very concerning in this tradition of Western Christianity, which is grace and election. Is it fair? Is the world fair? And if it's not fair, who do we take that up with? How do we understand the unfairness of the world? So that concern is also a religious concern, something Kierkegaard in a sense understood very well, that the world was not fair, but Kierkegaard had a way of thinking about that that's very different than the way many of us think about it. So genius, in this sense, I'm suggesting, has to do with the profound capacity to receive, to be an open vessel of the innermost stirrings of the human species, the environment, the time. And so this is not, again, I think, a particularly original idea, although it's significant to develop it. Now, as we move from receptivity towards suffering, we understand the transition is quite logical. Suffering in the most basic sense, and just so you know, a big part of my philosophy is a philosophy of suffering, because I've personally dealt with extensive illness and severe autoimmune illness, and so suffering is something I've had to experience and not think about, but so much has come to terms with. And I've come to realize that suffering has been my greatest philosophical teacher. And so a big part of philosophy, as I understand it, is understanding suffering, not intellectually, although that can be useful, but understanding how important suffering is to respect as a dimension of human life and of the life of the cosmos, it may seem. So suffering literally means to receive. Basically, it's a synonym for receptivity in the broadest sense. But notice that suffering for us connotes only the specifically negative part of the term, which is pain. To suffer simply is to undergo. And so here's why Kierkegaard is such a great genius. Kierkegaard's genius consists, I would say very simply, in the following reality. Kierkegaard relentlessly and self-consciously subjected himself to the full depths available to him of suffering under the conditions of the infinite, the eternal, and the oppressive inheritance of being a human being. Now, some of you may think, wow, that's a little intense. It is intense. Kierkegaard is a very intense figure, okay? I had a nervous breakdown, to use kind of an older psychological language, when I was an undergraduate. And I actually haven't done work on Kierkegaard since then. I published on Kierkegaard after that, but I basically had done all the fundamental work, and then I was able to develop that work. When I say fundamental, I mean I didn't re-engage in a super intense way some of the work I did when I was younger, because I actually kind of went a bit crazy, meaning I was hurt. I realized later I was very traumatized from certain childhood effects, and I had a breakdown while reading Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard was the person I was reading, and I won't go into the subject matter of what triggered my breakdown, but it was material connected to what I just said about Kierkegaard, and material that was connected to my own childhood suffering. So Kierkegaard's genius I described in a way that may be very foreign to us. Now let me directly connect it to German idealism. Let me start in a way the story over again. Okay. What happened in the 19th century that makes it so important? What happened in the 19th century that makes it so important? Well, here's an answer to that question. The 19th century is a century of extraordinary genius. It's not unique. There's great geniuses throughout history, but the 19th century begins to think about genius and categorize genius and value genius. And you know what? There were a lot of geniuses in the 19th century. So let me then think about Kierkegaard in the context of his historical framework. Kierkegaard is living in a time when Goethe, Hegel, the Schlegels, Novalis, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, these are all living names. These are names of people who either were alive when Kierkegaard was born, or were alive throughout his entire life, or who were basically very recent figures in history. So Kierkegaard was living through what is, from a historical standpoint, in music, art, philosophy, theology, simply one of the greatest explosions of concentrated individual and collective achievement in the society that we broadly call the West. So it was a century of genius, but it wasn't just a century of genius. I would suggest there was a moment of genius. And that moment of genius is connected to German idealism, because German idealism is the first conscious philosophical movement. I think this was lost very quickly in the historical tradition about German idealism. Here's my argument. German idealism was the first conscious historical movement that recognized the essential condition and importance of individual genius in the construction of the human race. Now, this is a deeply, deeply unpopular idea today, and this is one of the reasons we have completely abandoned it. We've so far not understood it. We haven't rejected it. We haven't even understood it. We haven't recognized it because it touches all of the egalitarian concerns that I mentioned earlier. And it triggers in all of us our inferiority complex. All of us basically fall under the passage on the tarantulas. If you want a critique of egalitarianism as just a form of psychological resentment, no one has done that better than Nietzsche in his section on the tarantulas in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So we don't really recognize this about German idealism, but let me explain briefly what I mean. Let me take the example of Hegel, because he's so important for Kierkegaard. Hegel was already not what we would think of as a recognized genius early in life, because one of his friends was already like that. Schelling was the Wunderkind, the wonder, miracle child of the German idealists. He went to the Tübingen Seminary or Stift, I believe, when he was 15. He'd already learned 7 or 8 languages, including Arabic, when he was in the Gymnasium, the German elite college preparatory school system. And he was a conventional genius. I mean, he was just extraordinarily fluent and gifted in many areas. Hegel, in the standpoint of achievement, if you're Hegelian in particular, you'll think Hegel might be the greatest genius. But the simple fact is Hegel, Schelling, Hölderlin, who were all together in school together when they were young teenagers, or older teenagers and young somethings in their 20s in Tübingen, they were all geniuses. And I think part of the reason for this is they lived in a moment in time in which there was an ideal of universal value, which was becoming human. And that ideal was inspiring to individuals. It was connected to an individual ideal of working to contribute something, to create something, to give birth to something. You see, the feminine dimension of genius is ultimately Platonic in the sense that it goes back to the great woman, Diotima, who is Socrates' great teacher in the Symposium. And what we call genius is maternal, because ultimately we don't think of people as geniuses in a significant sense who don't give birth to anything. But when we come to artists, and remember, Kierkegaard is an artist, he's the poet of existence, and he practices philosophy based on his understanding of Socrates' life, which is a maieutic art, or the art of midwifery. Maieutic is just a fancy, because Old Greek term that we use as an adjective for midwife, a person who helps give birth. And if you've read the Symposium, which I'm currently teaching now to some of my students, in Diotima's speech, every human being is basically yearning to give birth to something. Yearning, in a sense, to give birth to eternity, somehow, in time. So, genius, in the way I've introduced it, is actually a way of recognizing that what we may despair of in our individual life is still true and possible for us as a member of the human species. Genius actually reminds us what the level of attainment that we together collectively can accomplish. And you could say, Sam, but it's individuals who do this. It's always individuals who do everything. Even when we work together in groups, individuals must cooperate in those groups. So what we want as an ideal of humanity, of course, is not groups apart from individuals or individuals apart from groups. We want true communities, which are communities made up of self-conscious individuals who participate in those communities as individuals and together create something much greater and larger than an individual by themselves could achieve. However, most groups aren't like that. Because human nature is fallen or corrupted, this is how Kierkegaard thinks. And I think whether you're a Christian or not, you need a doctrine of the fall or sin, or you simply won't be able to understand philosophy. You don't have to believe it, but you have to understand the entire philosophical tradition is shaped by the idea that the world isn't how it should be. This is a fundamental idea in philosophy. And therefore, all of philosophy is ultimately about salvation. It's soteriological. And the reason academic philosophy at its worst becomes mere academic philosophy is exactly because the existential soteriological dimension that is philosophy's birthright has been completely neglected and forgotten, and you have simply a culture of assistant professors, people who, let's face it, are only doing philosophy because they're getting paid. And if they weren't getting paid and they didn't have jobs, they wouldn't be philosophers, and that person isn't a philosopher anyway, according to Plato, Socrates, Kierkegaard, and I think really any true philosopher. So the rejection of the existential dimension of philosophy, which is deeply connected to Kierkegaard's fundamental life concern, is connected at the same time with a very profound re-engagement with the nature of what it means to be human, the depths of our corruption and the depths of our possible attainment. And one of the things that genius reminds us of is that if we want to think about how extreme humans can be, and I would suggest today we're obsessed with how extremely negative humans can be. We have all kinds of shows that are extremely violent, extremely oriented towards the psychopathic dimension of human existence, what Kierkegaard called the demonic, which he predicted would become more prominent in art, broadly speaking. This was part of he would saw as the corrupting nature of the romantic influence. Kierkegaard also saw a very powerful positive aspect of romanticism, but he thought romanticism has this element we would code, let's say, broadly as Byronic, which is to say the demonic or daimonic, element of romanticism that can corrupt into a mere obsession with death, with darkness, and with corruption. And because we're obsessed with death, which is the most extreme negative corruption of the human being, a corruption that is towards a focus on people who actively kill people, which is to say a sick society like ours in the West is obsessed with people who kill people. I don't know why this is the case. I mean, I have actually ideas about it as a philosopher, but it's a really perverse aspect of Western society. So we are already obsessed with extremes of human nature. Our rejection notionally of the category of genius has mainly to do with our resentment that we mask under the category of egalitarian concern. But we've seen, I acknowledge the legitimacy, properly understood, of those concerns. I just don't actually think they're usually what's going on when we're talking about why we're not okay with genius. Because as I said, we all want excellence. We all want people who are good at things. We all want to be good at things. We all also want a society in which you're not judged as being inferior in your dignity as a human being for something that you have no control over, right? That's the fundamental egalitarian concern, and that's a concern of justice. But why would justice then lop off all of the tall flowers, as a metaphor has it? Why would justice diminish the world? This has always been a concern of elements that we would code somewhat crudely as right-wing or reactionary, but it's much more, you could just say, an aspect that is part of the romantic and artistic and cultural dimension of our lives. All of us, when we're resentful about what we don't have, will tend to focus our attitudes under the category of justice. All of us, when we're very happy and proud of what we do have, will unself-consciously identify within artistic dimension or persona of ourselves and our culture. And when we're in the artistic dimension of ourselves, we like creativity, we like novelty, we like extraordinary achievement or talent, right? We like Beyonce, we like Jay-Z. Whatever your sort of favorite artists are, part of the reason Beyonce and Jay-Z are famous is because they're both really, really good at what they do. Even if you don't know or listen to their particular type of music, if you go and listen to it and learn to appreciate it, from whatever background you are culturally, you can learn to recognize this is extraordinary, the level of achievement. So that's part of what we love. We love artists who are really good at what they do. They create, in a sense, an entire world of experience for us, and they remind us of what we can be as human beings. So the genius of Kierkegaard, then, is what, based on what I've suggested? Kierkegaard's capacity to suffer as profoundly as he did the very reality of human existence meant that existence and the unique conditions of modern culture in the 19th century seeped into the very marrow of his spirit, which was coursing with infinity and had eternity burning through it like an incinerating fire that in so many ways was a constant source of suffering to Kierkegaard as an individual, a constant source of suffering. And yet without that suffering, Kierkegaard simply would not have created much of what he created. Now, I'm not going to get into the general debate about the lone and suffering genius. I have complex views on that. I don't, in general, endorse the idea that you have to have a miserable life to create great art. I don't endorse that. You can always look at Haydn, for example, as a counterexample. However, there is a reason the romantic genius is the source of our idea of the genius as a particularly suffering person. And there's a very good reason, and I've introduced it already. It's because the romantic idea of genius, partly because of its drawing on the Platonic tradition, focuses us very deeply on the fact that the artist who is a genius must suffer. In order to be able to give anything back to the world, to give anything back to the world of spirit, culture, art, ideas, beauty, infinity, eternity, time, whatever, you must have received it. You must have suffered enough to have something to give back. And therefore, the more sensitive a person is at suffering, the more skilled they are at suffering. And I know that can sound paradoxical. I can't explain that here, but I do believe there's a thing called being skilled or virtuous in suffering. Because an artist who's very talented is particularly skilled at learning how to receive what they undergo and work it into something, they become capable of giving us extraordinary insight into their own times. And the deeper they go, you could say beyond the surface strata of their moment, the more significance they have over space and time, because they're reaching more and more fundamental levels of what it means to undergo the experience of having the potential of being a human. Because remember, being a human isn't something we just are. Being a human is fundamentally a calling and a task at which we can absolutely fail. And failure simply means we don't show up. One of the things that we're going to explore in this course, and particularly in the more detailed audio course that I'll be releasing at the end of this course, is that Kierkegaard's view of the human being, which is a very interesting view, and one that has very much shaped me, is that most of us as human beings don't quite even start becoming human. And Kierkegaard identifies that with not having pursued the pathway of becoming a self. So we'll get to some of this by the end of this lecture series, but you can tell how it's connected to this idea of genius. So the genius of Kierkegaard, I'm suggesting in a first and basic way, was his specific capacity to suffer so deeply under the conditions of humanity. And two of those conditions are conditions we have basically bracketed out in modern contemporary culture. Eternity, which has been completely eliminated since the end of the 19th and early 20th century. Eternity has been basically eclipsed in our culture. That's a very severe loss to us. Because even if you don't believe in eternity, the fact that humans can believe in eternity means we have an energy in us that's capable of generating a type of transcendence. And when we're not able to consciously work with that energy, you could say psychologically or even magically or philosophically or culturally or artistically, the energy goes somewhere else in a way that is very destructive, which would be part of how I would interpret the 20th century and the beginnings of the 21st century that we're now living in. But that's relevant, but in a sense, neither here nor there for now. So eternity is one of these things that I'm mentioning to us. It's very important for Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is a Christian. Kierkegaard is a deeply devout Lutheran, and he's a deeply devout philosopher, and he believes that what humans fundamentally are is something that in some sense is forever. And we're frightened by that. We can't even deal with the idea anymore. We're so psychologically surface dwelling, okay? So now the second idea connected to that, and it's different, very important that it's different, is infinity. In German, this is Unendlichkeit, right? Same as the word we have infinity, it means the lack of something definite or clear or finite, just like in the ultimate or origin of the term in our language families is in Greek, the aperon, that without peros, so without a limit or border or boundary or definition. So the Greeks felt that the finite was identified with the real, the good, and the beautiful. And one of the deepest stories about how the world we call modern emerged is essentially a series of internal debates amongst very significant philosophers who are kind of philosophical historians about essentially the infinitization of the subject. How infinity goes from being a vice amongst the Greeks, right? Infinity produces, for example, irrational numbers, to becoming a virtue eventually under Christianity. And I'm not here as an academic going to go into this story, which is something I'm very interested in. And indeed, I've studied with some of the main architects of some of the modern versions of the story, like Carsten Harries in his book Infinity in Perspective. But Harries is part of a tradition that goes back to Blumenberg. And that stuff ultimately, here's why I'm mentioning this, this goes back to Kierkegaard. So ultimately, part of what I want to suggest is if you've stuck with me this far, if you're interested, maybe you're one of these people who's very interested in the kind of big stories we tell about ourselves. If you know my podcast, the show Becoming Human, I've already told a very big story about humanity that I believed when I told it would basically be a way of understanding the world that was coming into being. And I think that's turning out to be the case. It was released on March 11th, 2020. Of course, I had no idea that was the day the global pandemic would officially be declared. But the simple fact is, everyone today, I think, who's curious intellectually and culturally is interested in big stories. They're interested in big stories about the human. And Kierkegaard, in the 19th century more broadly, but Kierkegaard in a way that is not recognized in modern academic scholarship, is actually the origin and the most creative thinker on what is, I think, the best set of ideas about how to understand the emergence of what we think of as the modern world and how it connects to Christianity, philosophy, and antiquity. And that has to do with these two ideas, eternity and infinity, which are very rarely coordinated. Now, connected to eternity and infinity is then, of course, our humanity, which I mentioned. Our humanity is partly characterized by the fact that it has an open-ended energy running through it that seems to come from the beyond that has no origin and go to the beyond that has no origin. This is similar to how, if you read the Tao Te Ching, the way is described, that it seems to be the mother of us all, including the gods. And that it comes, it seems like, from before, beyond the nothing, and passes through all things as they retract back into that and still continues. So there is some energy. Call it infinity, call it eternity, call it God, call it nothingness, and I'm not calling them the same thing. But call it what you will, it is an energy that Kierkegaard suffered under intensely. Now, here is part of how the genius takes on flesh. Kierkegaard was in a time in which, if you were interested in art and music and ideas and literary categorizations and understanding a big but scholarly and informed picture of where we were at in the world in 19th century Europe, Kierkegaard lived in the best time for that. And he was very interested in it. So now in this last part of the lecture, I want to explain how Kierkegaard's genius, as I've been introducing it, manifests itself in the form of his pseudonymous authorship. Pseudonym, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, of course, but it's just a word for sort of a pseudonym. Pseudo is the Greek word for false or deceptive or lying, but a pseudonym is therefore just a name that isn't your original given name. Now, how does this connect? Well, Kierkegaard was psychologically, I think, without any question, the most profound philosopher or thinker maybe ever, certainly in the past 200 years. I personally think, for example, Kierkegaard is a much better psychologist than Sigmund Freud and maybe than Carl Jung. Most people we call psychologists, I think, are not as psychologically perceptive as Kierkegaard was. And Kierkegaard has therefore had an enormous, although more you could say subterranean influence, but very significant in the field of what we would call academic psychology, particularly in the 20th century. So Kierkegaard's attention to human beings is part of his suffering. Kierkegaard is essentially a philosopher of life. And because he's a philosopher of life, and because he's a philosopher who's trying to live his experience, Kierkegaard is essentially dealing with the variety of human experience. And he recognizes, in order to be able to write philosophy or to write in a way that makes sense, you can't write from one perspective. You essentially have to understand how multiple different people in the world would experience the world and then coordinate those things and give them a free expression. And the ability to even recognize this, I want to suggest to you, is something no one had really recognized, arguably, except maybe in a different way, Plato. But Kierkegaard understood he couldn't communicate directly anything he wanted to say. He had to communicate it through becoming different people. And the ability to recognize that is itself, I would suggest, a very specific part of Kierkegaard's genius. What's amazing is Kierkegaard realized that goal. Kierkegaard effectively wrote an entire authorship, which we call his pseudonymous authorship, the main authorship we identify with Søren Kierkegaard. And that authorship is undertaken under a series of different names. And those names are not just names he wrote, they represent different characters. And those characters have highly distinct and developed viewpoints on the world that are different from each other. And so in order to appreciate Kierkegaard's authorship historically, or if you're an interpreter, you do have to deal with the pseudonyms, which many people do not do, which is a very big mistake. But I've just been focusing on the idea of Kierkegaard's genius as a way of developing the material from the last lecture. And I want to now bring that to a conclusion. Kierkegaard's capacity to become other people is rooted in the capacity that I would suggest great actors have. So, for example, if you listen, there's a great interview with Ian McKellen, and Ian McKellen talks about, Sir Ian McKellen, who I very much admire as an actor. McKellen talks about the capacity to become anyone, right? Including very bad characters. I think one of the examples in the interview is Shakespeare. And he says, you just have to be able to recognize how you are that potentially inside of yourself. Now, that's not an easy thing, right? That's clearly why some actors are a lot better than other people, other actors, I mean. And McKellen is one of those people who, if you watch McKellen, for example, doing Shakespeare, he can just go into a character without any cut or transition, and you don't notice anything. It is pure magic when you watch him do that. And McKellen's ability to do that is, again, because I think he's a genius of an actor, he is so receptive. And he has access to what he's receptive to. He can work with it creatively. Kierkegaard, in this sense, I think, uniquely in the history of philosophy, literature, and theology, essentially had a skill set that psychologically made him, I would say, almost similar to, if not part of the tribe, which is a very unique group of people, actors. And he essentially, I think, had an almost genius-like ability that would have been recognized in modern acting as a kind of ability to act, even if it wouldn't have manifested, I don't know, on the stage or something. But I can personally easily imagine a Kierkegaard who had had a happier and healthier upbringing, having become a type of, genius level actor. Kierkegaard combined this very unusual type of genius, which we separate radically from academic and intellectual abilities, with an extraordinary talent intellectually. And the result of this, combined with all of his personal suffering, was Kierkegaard had the ability to basically recognize most of what was happening in the world under the form of suffering it, culturally, musically, aesthetically, intellectually, spiritually. And he found a way to develop his entire literary philosophical authorship around the project of giving voice to these differences. So Kierkegaard's entire philosophy, the genius of Kierkegaard for me, as a teacher and a student of Kierkegaard, as a philosopher who practices philosophy as a path of spiritual transformation, which is what it has always been, and what Kierkegaard knew truly it had to be, what his genius consists in for me that is so special is an incredible receptivity of difference and its importance, its essential role in teaching, in living, and in understanding. And he doesn't just talk about this in this portentous, annoying academic way that academic philosophers can do, where they just throw huge words at us, difference, sameness, ontology. Kierkegaard manifests it in a literarily brilliant and delightful way throughout the pseudonymous authorship. And in so doing, he culminates what no one had been able to bring together, which is a synthesis of the intellectual scientific rigor of the German idealist tradition with the literary, romantic, lived focus of the early Romantic movement in particular, which was in many ways, if you follow the scholarly debates, I think part of German idealism, but basically always had a very difficult time being fully assimilated into the great German idealist systems. So Kierkegaard essentially, sort of like Novalis, he achieved what Novalis said a genius would want to do, what philosophy has to do, which is the ultimate paradox, humanly speaking, which is to create a system of the systemless, or to create a systemless system. What would a systemless system of philosophy be? It would be a philosophy that intellectually is as rigorous, profound, and penetrating as anything that has ever existed, but manifests itself in a way that is so literarily delightful, so psychologically acute, so perceptive to human nature, so poetic, aesthetic, erotic, and artistic, that if you have no concern for that intellectual scientific side, you will still find Kierkegaard delightful and instructive. And I think that is a very big part, although by no means even a full introduction, but it's a very big part of the genius of Søren Kierkegaard. And in my next lecture, I hope to develop more of these themes, and I'm going to start focusing specifically on some of his famous works that I'll just touch on, and I'll develop the themes more of German idealism and German Romanticism that I've introduced in this lecture. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Samuel Loncar. I'm a philosopher and the founder and creator of the Becoming Human Project. If you like this video, please do click like and subscribe. Maybe it's down here. And share it with your friends. Maybe you guys watch it. If you're interested, comment. Let me know if you have any feedback. I'm delighted for all the feedback I have gotten, and I'm always happy to learn from friendly critics and also just get any ideas that you have. So thanks again. Please do like, subscribe, support me on Patreon, and check out my website for more of my courses and materials. Have a great day.